My name's Lisa. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Guilford Free Library this evening for tonight's program, The Long Damn Summer of 42, written and presented by Mr. Robert Berkowitz. It's no accident that this is happening tonight. I heard somebody in the audience say the same thing. It's a somber anniversary for the country. It's an important anniversary, an important event, holiday for the Jewish community, being the New Year, which I understand is a time of some apprehension, but also joy and hope.
Sorry.
That's all right. It's good, we can adjust it now. So I have a feeling a lot of you know Robert already, but I will give you a little bio sketch. He is a 15-year resident of Guilford who was, in his early years, an adjunct professor and lecturer in history at Rutgers University. He went on to become a strategic advisor for Fortune 100 companies, and he is the author of several groundbreaking industry forecasting studies. He has recently published The Long Damn Summer of 42, which is available on medium.com, so you can read it for yourselves as well. He will speak tonight about that long ago summer of hope, courage, and tragedy, and ponder the lessons of it for us and for our times. The presentation is going to run about 45 minutes, and there'll be lots of time for questions and answers afterwards. You may hear a closing announcement for the library. You can disregard that. I would ask you to take a moment and silence your cell phones, and to join me in welcoming Mr. Robert Berkowitz.
Thank you very much, Lisa. First, I want to thank the library staff, especially Lisa, Cody, Rob McLeod, and Loretta Lyons, who have hosted and nicely publicized this event. I'd also like to thank Shannon Gale, who's head of the Guilford Community TV station, for providing the equipment, and who hopefully, if there are no glitches, will upload the presentation onto YouTube. Without further ado, let me begin. It is September 11th. On that pristine blue sky morning, 17 years ago, I was in Grand Central Station on my way to a meeting at the World Financial Center, a complex of office buildings connected by pedestrian bridges to the Twin Towers. I was running late. At 9:15, as I was about to step onto the 42nd Street shuttle, I noticed everyone on their cell phones. That was unusual back then. I instinctively checked mine. There was a voicemail from my 80-year-old mother in Florida. Among the few words that I could make out from the panic and shrieking voice were, "Where are you?" and "It's happening again." And that's how she said it. I feared my father had another heart attack. He was fine. My mother was another story, at least for the eternal few minutes until she heard back from me. Her distress was understandable. Aware that I was working on a consulting project at the World Financial Center, she had confused it with the Twin Towers. Years earlier, I had worked on the upper floor of the South Tower. From my office window, I had a breathtaking view of the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, and downtown Jersey City, where my immigrant parents first settled nearly a century before. I would often describe to my mother that wondrous view of those historic landmarks, of freedom and safety that thrilled and relieved my grandparents as their steamships navigated into New York Harbor. That image stuck vividly with her, as did the one of the sun-drenched ridge of the New Jersey Watchung mountain range, where my grandparents and their newly arrived relative would first gather for their annual family picnics. My mother, as a Jewish mother would be, was proud I had achieved the American dream my grandparents had aspired to their entire adult lives. However, until she heard my voice that 9/11 morning, all she could see was the horrific image of United Airlines Flight 175 ramming into the South Tower just a few floors from where I would often describe that panoramic view. Days later, as my mother began to shake loose that grotesque image and accept that she had not lost me, I asked her what she meant when she said, "It's happening again." "Did I say that?" she replied in a surprised voice. "Were you thinking of Pearl Harbor?" I prompted. That seemed a fair assumption, as it was the last time America had come under a surprise attack by a foreign power. "Oh no, I wouldn't have thought that," she said, pausing, as she began to find her memory. Pearl Harbor was shocking and terrifying, but that's what got us to finally declare war on that madman Hitler. That's what gave us hope. Then came a long pause as the memory haltingly and painfully surfaced. "Oh no," she repeated, pausing again. It was what followed. "What followed?" I asked. In a somber voice, my mother just said, "That summer." Was my mother thinking of that summer when she said, "It's happening again"? Perhaps she was thinking of the '93 bombing of the Twin Towers, or more likely, the premature death of my brother the year before. She didn't know. Aware that my mother was still emotionally raw over the unexpected passing of my brother, I was inclined to believe that when she uttered those haunting words, "It's happening again," she feared she was reliving that devastating loss, and not that long ago summer. I pressed no further. However, years later, as I began to research that summer, I stumbled on a heavily quoted Jewish New Year sermon delivered in a special heavily quoted in a Jewish New Year sermon in a 1942 high holiday section of the Newark Evening News, the city's then largest circulating newspaper and paper of record for my family. I showed it to my mother, who was now living in Guilford. She and I were very familiar with the rabbi who delivered it. We had gone to hear him speak the evening President Kennedy was assassinated, my first 9/11 experience. That Sabbath sermon was as powerful and inspiring as it was comforting. The rabbi had a special way of finding hope where there was tragedy. My mother, now in physical decline, but mentally acute as ever, glanced down at the article headlined, quote, "Jews hopeful as New Year dawns." Somewhat confused as what to expect. Cautiously, she began to read the opening words of the Rosh Hashanah sermon that spoke of the old eyes of the Jewish people, who have wept bitter tears in many lands, where persecution of Jews prevailed in such tragic measure, and where death and destruction have followed us like the shadows of our existence. As she continued down the column, her eyes froze at the sight of the bold print subtitle, 9 million lost. Her bony arthritic fingers began to tremble. She could go no further. She did not need to. Slowly, the dam of painful memories cracked and crumbled until the swelling up of tears in her old Jewish eyes could no longer be held back. That Rosh Hashanah sermon, likely the most shocking and tragic in Jewish history, was delivered after the sun had set behind that first ridge of the Watchung mountain range on the 11th of September of that long damn summer of 42. As I worked on the essay, The Long Damn Summer of 42, friends and neighbors would approach me at local coffee haunts like Cilantro's or Marketplace, Quonset Hut, glance down at the pile of notes strewn across the table, and quiz me. Hey, Robert, so what's it about? Since I didn't think it possible to answer the question in the few words expected in such casual settings, I would say it was about my cousin Allie, a Jewish boxer from Newark, New Jersey, who fought for the lightweight title of the world when my relatives in Europe were fighting for their lives. Although the answer was as truthful as far as it went, it didn't really capture the essence of the story. I finally came up with a 6-word subtitle, An Untold Story of Stolen Dreams, that I thought best capsulized it. However, as I began to work on this presentation, I found myself continuing to struggle with that simple question and wrestled with more than a few answers. What I'd like to do this evening is share those answers, 8 in all, because they became my stepping stones to my understanding of what the long damn summer of 42 is really about. So let's begin. What's it about? 1, it's about a summer when more Jews were murdered than in any season of the Holocaust or in any season of the long history of Jewish persecution. 2, it is about 2 extraordinary and largely untold events that, especially for my family, bookended that long damn summer. The first event fell on a Sabbath evening in May of 42, when my cousin Allie Stolz, a 23-year-old second-generation Jewish boxer from Newark, fought for the lightweight title of the world at Madison Square Garden in a 15-round bout that ended in one of the great injustices in boxing history. The second event, which I've alluded to, fell on the Sabbath evening of the Jewish New Year on that September 11th, when Rabbi Joachim Prinz, speaking to 2,400 hopeful congregants in the sanctuary of Newark's largest synagogue, delivered a sermon that disclosed for the first time in a public forum the breadth and depth of destruction of European Jewry, what later came to be known as the Holocaust. 3, it is about a summer that witnessed bold acts of courage and character. To name a few, there was Allie's refusal to bend to the wishes of the mob that controlled boxing, even if it ruined his lifelong dream of becoming the lightweight champion of the world. There was Rabbi Prinz's refusal to bend to the wishes of the State Department, that he remained silent until the mounting evidence of mass extermination could be fully confirmed, something he could not do when the evidence was all but undeniable and time was of essence to evaluate, plan, and execute all feasible, if belated, rescue operations. And there was the nameless Polish Catholic family who, at great risk to their lives, hid my cousins Tunia and Poldy, medical clinicians who had miraculously escaped the notorious Janowska labor camp in Lvov, Poland. 4. It is about a summer that saw dreams born of hope and fear painfully morph into nightmares. Gone was Allie's lifelong dream of becoming the lightweight boxing champion of the world and an exemplar of the Jewish fighting spirit when it was never more needed. Gone were the dreams of thousands of Jewish fans who packed Madison Square Garden and the tens of thousands more glued to their radios, hoping that Allie would send an unmistakable message across the Atlantic that Allie and the Allies were on their way. Gone were the dreams of the members of the larger American Jewish diaspora who had raised unprecedented funds to keep their European brethren alive, hoping to buy time until they could be liberated by the Allied forces from the Nazi labor camps. Gone were the dreams of my grandparents that our relatives trapped in Poland would someday be free to join the annual family picnic at Crystal Lake Park, a pastoral retreat atop that breathtaking first ridge of the Watchung mountain range, where Cousin Allie, the newly crowned lightweight boxing champion of the world, would display his winning skills. And most of all gone were the dreams of so many families in Europe that someday they would awaken from their living nightmare and find themselves havened in America. 5. It is a story about the witting and unwitting who had a hand in stealing those dreams. There was Frankie Carbo, the shadow commissioner of boxing and mob thug, who ran the number rackets for the Lucchese crime syndicate, and who spitefully put a fix on Allie's 15-round title fight that the vast majority of fans who packed the Garden, the major sports writers who covered it, and the referee who cast the only honest vote all knew Allie had won. There was Hitler admirer Charles Lindbergh and his legion of America First followers who lobbied to prevent America's entry into the war, which, had it happened earlier, could have saved the lives of millions. There was fascist demagogue Father Charles Coughlin and his millions of weekly radio listeners who tolerated and even embraced such rants as sending Jews back where they came from in leaky boats. There was the U.S. Congress that refused to loosen its restrictive and racially biased immigration laws and quotas, even voting down a 1939 workaround bill to allow 20,000 German refugee children into the country, in actions amounting to death sentences for countless asylum-seeking Jewish refugees. There was the U.S. State Department that used its discretionary authority to place such staggering and intimidating eligibility and documentation requirements on overwhelmed and panicked visa applicants that only a limited percentage of those pitifully small immigration quotas were ever filled. Sound familiar? There was the more than 2/3 of the American public that, according to polls taken in the 30s by Fortune and Gallup, that opposed the admission of asylum-seeking refugees, and specifically refugee children, There were the leaders of the democracies of the world who, in the summer of 1938, refused to raise their collectively meager immigration quotas, and whose fateful decision to do so entered into the Nazi calculus months later to abandon its policy of the removal of Jews by emigration and replacing it with ever more brutal cleansing actions, including compulsory resettlement and concentration, mass executions by bullets, and finally, systematic extermination by poison gas. And most of all, there were the nameless many in Germany and the Nazi-occupied territories, the police and the paramilitary forces directly complicit in carrying out those cleansing actions, the virulently anti-Semitic Nazi Party members and fellow travelers who cheered them on, the civil servants who planned and operationalized them, the industrialists, entrepreneurs, and shopkeepers who profited from them, and the vast population of passive assenters and silent dissenters, all without whom the final solution would have remained just a morbid fantasy of Hitler and his depraved cronies. 6. It is a story about the misplaced guilt of the powerless, that of my grandparents and mother, who despite tireless efforts to help secure life-saving affidavits of sponsorship and transit visas for the Austrian wing of the family, never forgave themselves for being unable to do the same for their many more relatives in Poland. That of my father, Bernard, who fought in 4 major World War II campaigns, earned the Silver and Bronze Star for his heroism in the invasion of southern France and daring reconnaissance missions in Germany and Italy, efforts that helped save hundreds of thousands of starving Jews languishing in death camps, but who never stopped regretting that he was unable to liberate a single relative. And that of my cousin Tunya, who in the spring of 1945, as American troops were beginning to liberate the Nazi death camps, telegraphed my family in America the bittersweet words, "Only I and brother alive." The last time Tunya saw his mother Clara, she was in a rail car on her way to the Belzec death camp. Fortunate to have engineered an escape that saved his life and that of his younger brother Poldy, but helpless to save the life of his mother, sister, and father, he remained emotionally scarred and haunted for the rest of his life. Tunya, as well as Poldy, suffered by far the greatest consequences of the misplaced guilt of the powerless. There is an expression loosely borrowed from the Talmud and quoted in Schindler's List that, quote, "He who saves one person saves the entire universe." My family struggled to console themselves in having to save more than a few universes, but it was the many they were unable to save that shadowed them for the rest of their lives. 7. It is a family story about a few of the millions of good and ordinary people, those many universes of one, who just wanted to live their lives, pursue their innocent passions, and share the simple joys of family life like all of us, and whose stories need to be told time and time again. There was my grandmother's older sister, Tante Rosa, and her son, Norbert, to whom I owe my given name, Robert. Both were caught in the deadly crosshairs of Anschluss, the Nazi occupation of Austria, and Kristallnacht, the deadly night of broken glass pogrom. Norbert died during those hellish 9 months of 1938. Following his death, Tante Rosa, and Tante is Yiddish for aunt, a naturalized U.S. citizen, returned to America physically and emotionally spent, wanting nothing more than to die. Her wish was fulfilled a few months later. There was Uncle Leon, to whom I owe my second given name, Leonard. Uncle Leon was a gentle and sweet bachelor whose great passion was his priceless stamp collection. Despite his own uncertain future in Poland in 1941, Uncle Leon shipped that collection to his younger brother David, who was barely surviving in Vienna and desperately seeking to emigrate to America to be with his children. It was the time when the Nazis had halted voluntary emigration from Austria and begun mandatory resettlement to the east. It was also a time when the State Department, in one of the cruelest ironies of history, had dramatically curtailed its issuance of visas, speciously arguing as one of its justifications that among Jewish applicants with families still in Nazi-occupied territories possibly lurked Nazi agents that pose a risk to national security. So much for mastering the art of proportional response. Whether David used that stamp collection to bribe a Nazi clerk to issue him an exit visa from Austria, or to persuade a U.S. consular office that he was not a Nazi agent, and to grant him a transit visa to America, it saved his life. Sadly, the following summer of '42, Uncle Leon, his two sisters, Celia and Clara, pregnant cousin Ruth, and nieces Donchi and Ellie, among other family members, were rounded up by jack-booted security police, armed with machine guns, truncheons, and barking dogs, and herded into rail cars that terminated at the gates of the Belzec death camp. And there was cousin Ignacy, a brilliant chemical engineer in his early 40s and in the prime of his career, who was esteemed the Einstein of the family. In letters written from the outskirts of Warsaw in early 1940, he asked my family in America to help our Polish relatives emigrate. One letter struck an urgent and foreboding note. Quote, "Because it is before Passover and great international tensions, one doesn't know what the morning will bring." Ignacy knew that Jewish holidays were not a good time. The prior September, his Uncle Edward was dragged from his home on Rosh Hashanah. Several days later, he was shot along with 43 other prominent Jewish citizens of the city of Przemysl and dumped into a mass grave by the Nazi mobile death squads. That fear of what the morning will bring, that so worried Ignacy, came to pass 16 months later when he and his wife Janina were rounded up along with 250,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and herded into rail cars that terminated at the gates of the Treblinka death camp. That murderous liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto began on July 23rd on Tish B'Av, considered the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, and ended on September 21st, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, marking the seasonal end of the long, damp summer of '42. Lastly, the long, damp summer of '42 is about not forgetting. In a prophetic plea for remembrance, near the end of one of Cousin Ignacy's letters, he asked my grandmother Helene to please not forget us. However, this story is more than about not forgetting loved ones that perished. It is also about not forgetting the lessons of the Holocaust in the hope that we and future generations do not relive even a shadow of that history. And there are many lessons. However, two strike a deep nerve in me, not only because of what my family endured leading up to the long damn summer of '42, but because they may be the most instructive if that dark history is never to repeat itself. The first is the urgent need to speak out unequivocally and unapologetically against the dehumanization, demonization, and scapegoating of minorities. The second is the crying need for genuine empathy of the other. And by this I mean a really deeply reflective and soul-searching empathy that moves the knowing many to compassionate and moral action based on a feeling of shared humanity. It is hard to overstate that had enough Americans in the 1930s felt such depth of empathy for the millions of asylum-seeking Jewish refugees to set aside their anxieties, fears, and prejudices of the other, countless lives would have been saved. One of the most daunting challenges today is how to teach and spread such empathy other than by personal example. I do not have a good answer. However, I do know of one teachable example quite well. It is the inspiring public life of my teenage role model you're now familiar with, Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Prinz fought racial bigotry and xenophobia with the same passion that he battled anti-Semitism. He was unambiguous in his conviction that every person, race, religion, or ethnic background aside, was a precious creature of God and deserving of equal worth and dignity. In explaining in 1960, as president of the American Jewish Congress, why he and 40 of his officers and members picketed a Fifth Avenue Woolworth department store to protest lunch counter segregation in the South, Prinz said, "As Jews, we are animated by our prophetic tradition, which asserts that we are all creatures of one God." It was Prinz's lived life of empathy, drawn from the raw and painful scars of the Jewish historical experience, that gave him such insight into the human cost of its opposite, the silence of callous and careless indifference. That insight is best captured in the words he spoke at the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom. I would like to quote from that short, powerful address, which directly preceded his friend Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. With the Lincoln Memorial at his back, Rabbi Prinz reminded us that in the realm of the Spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago, when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. Prinz continued, drawing back to those darkening years in Germany, presaging the Holocaust. When I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under these tragic circumstances was that the most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people, which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality and in the face of mass murder. And then Prinz made a final urgent plea to his fellow citizens. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. It must speak up and act, not for the sake of the black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. It was that lived life of empathy based on those three tenets of neighbor as a moral concept, the idea and aspiration of America itself, and the refusal to remain silent that sent Prinz to the picket lines in the early days of the civil rights movement to protest racial discrimination with the same passion that had sent him to the pulpit in Berlin to protest and sound the alarm bells of the metastasizing anti-Semitism in the early days of Nazi Germany. This past summer in Berlin, Jews and Muslims joined together to express solidarity in the wake of growing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Germany. Led by rabbis and imams, Jews paired with their Muslim counterparts on tandem bikes and pedaled from the imposing Holocaust memorial to Babelplatz, the city square where a few months after assuming power in 1933, the Nazis set fire to more than 20,000 books, including those of Rabbi Prinz, to purge the country of its un-German spirit and Jewish intellectualism. At that city square, there is now a pane of thick glass set in a cutout of cobblestone pavement. Beneath that window is a subterranean room filled with empty bookshelves to house the thousands of tomes that went up in flame on that night of shame. Beside the window is a bronze plaque embedded in the cobblestone, etched with the prophetic words of the 19th century Jewish-born German poet Heinrich Heine. It reads, that was a prelude. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. I do not know the thinking of the organizers who planned the itinerary for that bike ride. However, it is hard for me not to see it as a 9-year trip back in time from the long damn summer of '42, past the night of broken glass in 1938, when Rabbi Prinz's synagogue was destroyed, to the dawn of Nazi power in 1933. It is also difficult not to reflect on that bike ride as a haunting reminder of how differently history might have turned out had the knowing many had the courage to speak out, organize, and vote against the bigotry and hate that ignited that conflagration of books, or had enough compassion, empathy, and humanity to harbor its victims before it was too late. Painfully, we cannot rewrite history. However, we can turn to history to reflect and draw on its lessons. Today, with more than 22 million refugees worldwide, many fleeing persecution, starvation, and homelessness, the world is living through its worst refugee crisis since the 1930s. Last year, I attended a local benefit event for an organization that helps refugees and other displaced people who have suffered persecution based on race, nationality, and religious belief. At that event, I met a family fortunate to have found haven in America before our doors had an unwelcome mat slapped down in front of the extended arm of Lady Liberty. The mother of this grateful family, trying to make a life for themselves here, just as my grandparents did more than a century ago, shared her fears about her not-so-fortunate relatives left behind to face pogroms of their own. As I listened to her story, I wondered how many of her Tanta Roses, Claras and Celia's, Uncle Leon's and Edward's, Cousin Donchi's, Ignacy's and Nellie's and Ruth's would someday reunite with her family in America or other national havens. Clearly, we alone cannot solve this unprecedented refugee crisis, nor should we minimize the need for thorough scrutiny of the legitimacy of asylum requests and for rigorous vetting of the kind that would have screened out the terrorists that attacked us on 9/11. However, to largely slam our doors on asylum-seeking refugees, engage in religious and ethnic profiling, separate children from parents, and house them in cage-like detention centers borders on a moral callousness that betrays our better angels and ultimately plays into the hands of those very evil actors who wish to destroy us and the democratic values that define us. In the 1930s, Hitler created the refugee crisis. Tragically, because the democracies of the world shamefully failed to address it, 6 million lost lives later, Hitler solved it. Time will tell if America and the democracies of the world turn inward out of fear and indifference, as they did in the 1930s, or outward with courage, empathy, and enlightened self-interest, and make a best faith effort to address today's unprecedented refugee crisis. A crisis, in no small measure, created by the likes of those who attacked us on 9/11 and greatly magnified by all too many self-serving demagogic leaders who dangerously stoke the flames of fear, resentment, and hate by demonizing and scapegoating its victims. Let me end with these reflections. If we live by and teach those three simple principles of neighbor as a moral concept, the idea and aspiration of America itself, and the refusal to remain silent in the face of bigotry and hatefulness of the other, then we can only hope that my mother's haunting words on 9/11, "It's happening again," will never again come to pass, and no spiritual leader of any faith will ever have to recount to his or her congregants a year of unspeakable death and destruction of millions of innocent lives because of their race, religion, or ethnicity, as Rabbi Prinz was pained to do 76 years ago this evening in his 11th of September 1942 Rosh Hashanah sermon. And if we genuinely strive to live by and teach those three simple tenets as passionately as Rabbi Prinz, then just maybe, we will find some redemptive meaning in the tragic story of the long damn summer of 42. That, to me, is what this story is really about, and why I have felt compelled to tell it. Thank you, and as my grandfather Herman would say to his neighbors of all faiths on the Jewish New Year of Rosh Hashanah, good year. Thank you. When I studied history and taught it for a while in my early days, it was basically the going kind of conventional wisdom was that people in this country didn't really know what was going on until 43, 44. Whereas my parents and grandparents knew very well what was going on. And they were getting letters. And at least in Newark, and we had a large extended family in Newark and Jersey City, We all knew what was going on. And you know, my mother was writing letters constantly to congressmen, to senators, and then of course to our relatives to lift their spirits in Vienna. And they would then correspond to the relatives in Poland. So yeah, that was a surprise to me, how much they knew. Yeah.
Robert, I really want to congratulate you because as your parents' generation, or all of our parents' generation are dying, and their stories are dying, it's so important to keep the message out there. And the way you've done it in kind of a very anecdotal, structured process is something that I see high schoolers would be interested in hearing, college students would be interested in hearing, because we can't forget, you know, because it's still happening all over the world in different ways, as we all know, with 24/7 TV, etc. So thank you for all the effort. And now you have this fabulous story for yourself, too.
Yeah, and family. There was a Pew study done right after Charlottesville last year, and what it did was it correlated. So there's a direct correlation between lack of knowledge of the Holocaust and tolerance level of neo-Nazism, and that the greatest correlation and the greatest amount of lack of knowledge of the Holocaust was among the millenniums. They didn't even survey what's the generation after, the X generation that comes after the millennials. So that's why you're absolutely right, the importance of speaking to all age groups, especially the youngsters for whom this is going to be just some distant abstract history. And history is not as prominent in the schools today, studied as it was.
You know, and the schools are running out of speakers to come and tell the story.
I'm game to
We'll send your resume out there.
Yeah, Julie.
I agree entirely with what Marcia said, and again with the skill with which you organize, the structure of something that seemed really anecdotal but had such a tight structure and effective structure. And I was just thinking, all right, my father's side was Jewish, and relatives were lost that we never knew. He never knew, in Russia, Jews in Russia. And so I didn't grow up with a lot of awareness of it, and we were in Indiana too. But I'm thinking that you had this family that was so aware, your parents and grandparents, those survived, and you were born right after the war, right? You were kind of born right after the war. So you were not there during the letter writing and all that, during trying to save, but you were there within a few years. I don't know, like you're 4 or 5 years old.
And at the end of 47.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, well, that's true, end of 47, that how much discussion took place. I mean, how, as a child, as an adult, you're fully, well, appreciative is not an adequate word, but aware and appreciative and pondering and exposed to all this when you were a young child.
I did not learn about this, a good part of it, the losses, until the summer of '61, which was during the Eichmann trial, when it was hard for parents to ignore it. And part of it, my parents wanted basically to protect me, as other parents wanted to protect their children from the trauma of that era and wanted to just get on with their lives. My dad in particular, he was not only traumatized by the war, but by the loss of relatives that just wanted to push forward, and it was the Eichmann trial that really brought it to the fore. And I learned about, as I talk about at the end of the article that I wrote, I talk about that the way my parents, actually my aunt, my mother's sister, who told me about the summer of '42, and she told me about it through my cousin Allie's boxing match, because I was such a big sports fan. That was the way, the hook that got me. I didn't want to hear about stuff. I'd rather play ball than watch this guy in the glass cage being in Jerusalem. I was 13 years old at the time. So my aunt said, "Did you know you have a cousin who fought for the lightweight boxing title of the world? Let me tell you about this summer." And she actually told me about it when we were at Crystal Lake, which my parents continued to go to after the war. Kate.
I have a question about the disposition of the letters. They're obviously precious to you. Do you have a plan in place, or are you thinking about a plan to see to it that those letters go somewhere important?
Actually, I'll be on November 11th. I'll be speaking in New Jersey at a fairly big event, a jointly sponsored event by the Jewish Historical Society of New Jersey and the Holocaust Council of New Jersey, which is one of the largest in the country. And I'm going to discuss with them about archiving the archives, because a lot of my family in America lived in Jersey City and Newark at the time. So that's my goal. I think it would be, rather than trying to deposit it with the Holocaust Museum or some larger archival system where it will get lost, I think it would be much more valued and appreciated by people locally. Yes?
So, it's interesting that you're talking about the Eichmann trials and stuff. I remember listening to them on the radio, and history, about not teaching history and people knowing less about it and having more, say, specific kinds of leanings. I was born in 52, so in my growing up, I lived in a Jewish and Italian neighborhood, and there was lots of examples of the Holocaust right in front of me. I remember being in a department store with my mother, and this woman went to give money to the cashier, and she had numbers on her arms asking my mother about that, what that meant, and she told me. And we had a man who lived in our buildings right in front of us who was a survivor of the camp. So it was very clear, very common, the Eichmann trials. And now, it seems to me, we pussyfoot around history. It's important for people to talk about it, and talk about it very vividly, I think. We kind of pussyfoot around. I listen to the radio and they say, well, something graphic is coming up, be forewarned, that in school you can't say this, you can't say... I think it's so important for us to be so clear and upfront and talk about things and talk about the people, because the living examples are gone.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for people to really, as you were saying, the less you know about history, the more you sympathize with neo-Nazis. It needs to be vivid, and people need to be aware of what happened and what can be happening.
Yes. Hi.
Well, I understand that the article was published, I'm not sure where, and I wonder if your speech, an article, is available in print that we could...
The article is available, in fact, that's a great point. The article is available on medium.com, so you can read it online. It's no charge. You just go to medium.com or Google. The easiest way is just Google the long damn summer of 42. There's nothing else. I don't know that name. And it'll take you right to the article. And that article also has a lot of illustrations. It has images and pictures of family members as well. So this speech, hopefully, if there are no glitches, and I don't look like a B-rated actor, you'll get, I guess it will go on to the Guilford Community TV station, they'll play it, and then it'll be uploaded to YouTube. So if those of you whose email addresses I don't have, feel free to put them on that. I have a sheet there for it, or take a copy. There's a copy there with my email address, and just email me, and I can let you know when it's coming out. I'm also working on expanding this into a book between the article and this presentation, and that, I don't know when that will happen, but hopefully sooner than later. Wait, just one gentleman back there. Yes?
Yes, I just wanted to comment that during World War II, when General Eisenhower first became aware of the terrible extermination camps, Eisenhower put out an order that wherever any extermination camp was found, that the American soldiers had to bring every one of the Germans in all the outlying towns to come to the concentration camp to see the horrors that were taking place.
Yeah, no, Eisenhower was,
Strangely enough,
yeah. Peter?
Yeah, I just want to say, there was one letter that you gave me that I could not decipher, and I don't think it's in German. The handwriting is very strange, very clear, and if there's anyone in the audience who, say, is very familiar with some of the German handwriting is different, but I can decipher everything but this letter, and I'm wondering whether it was in Polish or some other language.
No, I don't think.
No, it wouldn't have been, it was very close to German.
Could have been, it might have been a Slavic.
Well, so if anyone in the audience happens to know Polish or any other Slavic
It's
language.
Hungarian, the Hungarian borders.
Yeah, so.
Okay, I know Andrew, so I can probably create an image of at least excerpts from it, and then I can send it to you, or send it out to people and see if they know, come across it. Andrea?
I just want to say that on May 10th, 2018, our governor signed legislation to require Holocaust education in the schools. So they do have to teach it. In our schools in Connecticut, I don't know what the rest of the states, but there is now legislation. And I definitely want to get you in touch with Margie Shapiro from the ADL, who's in charge of education, who does a Holocaust curriculum that she gives to the high schools. So I think your story was riveting.
Yeah.
I think kids will listen to it. I really think you've got something here
I'd be
that
happy.
has a lot of legs for this, for New Jersey, for Connecticut, anybody lucky enough to have you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I would love
Margie lives right in Guilford.
Yeah, great. Barbara, Carol.
Speaking of being right in Guilford, one of my burning discomforts is the fact that when Guilford turned 375 years, there was a big hoopla. And the native people who lived here before the Europeans came were never mentioned. That fact and the fact that our sports teams in Guilford are called the Indians. And in the town hall, there's a big poster listing what the colonists paid for Satan's head. I find that really racist. It's something that's existing right here and going on every day, and people are totally oblivious to it. This town didn't start 375 years ago. This land belonged to people and was inhabited by people who suffered a type of genocide, really. So I guess it's like think globally and act locally.
Both, yeah, I agree.
It comes into my head, and thank you.
Yeah, that's true. Bob?
So first of all, I think it's very important that your speech was terrific, and bearing witness to all this is so important. And there are two things that are sort of troubling. One is that during the period when it occurs, right, there's tremendous insensitivity based on ignorance. In 1938, I think it was the freshman class at Princeton University voted Hitler the greatest man in the world and the second greatest man in the world. After Einstein, he was first or second, whatever. And that was a remarkable thing to take place. And you talked about all of the ignorance during that period of time, during the period of war and the Holocaust. And then you have a period of time where people sort of, more recent and they recognize what's happened. But then it disappears, you said, among the millennials. There's a lack of knowledge, and that breeds a lack of vision to the growth of neo-Nazism. My own experience, my father, as you know, was head of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee after the war, and was one of the first people into Bergen-Belsen. And he never talked about the Holocaust with us. Right? was a very searing experience. He only talked about what he did, about we ordered food and so forth and so on. And it's very, the other experience I had with him was, we had lunch a number of years ago before he passed away with a bishop who asked him, Bishop Sullivan, one from the Catholic Church, asked my father, what did he think of Pope Pius XII, who was controversial pope during the II. And my father just said, well, that's for the historians to say. He didn't really want to say. So it's understandable, but it is unfortunate when people do not speak up about these atrocities.
One of the conundrums, just quickly, and then one of the things that I struggled with back in the 30s, I mentioned 2/3 of the American public were against allowing refugees into the country. About the same percentage were against the persecution of Jews. Now, clearly there was a strain of anti-Semitism among the population at the time. But the argument back then was, well, we're going through a depression, and especially 37, 38, there was another recession, and it looked like it was yet the repeat of the 1931-32 financial crisis and recession. So there was a lot of economic anxiety, and there was high unemployment, significantly high, like in 20+% unemployment. So why are we going to allow other people into the country when we can't even provide jobs and care for our own people? What that made me, what I thought about that, and that's why I said empathy is the issue, because there's going to be in any time in history, there's always going to be economic anxiety. Look at today. You know, the justification for keeping immigrants out is in part economic reasons. There are economic problems, but you know, the economy is booming, relatively speaking. Relatively. I mean, it's compared to the Depression.
Yeah.
So you will always find reasons. So that's why I emphasize empathy, enough empathy. And I don't mean the feel-good, heart-bleeding empathy. I mean really thoughtful empathy, soul-searching empathy that allows you to kind of set aside your own economic anxieties, prejudices, fears, and to say, these people are part of humanity. Doug.
So education is so important, but silence is not unusual. My family, I was associate editor of the Jewish paper in Cincinnati in the late 70s, and I wrote many stories about the survivors there, the big survivor community. My mother and father read every article I wrote, and 15 years later, my mother sends me the family photos, and then in it there's a clipping of her grandfather's death. It's his obituary, and it said he came from Europe in late December 1941, and I was older now, and I called my mother up and said, "Your grandfather came from Denmark in 1941?" She said, "Yes." Her father's sister went back and got him and brought him, and they came on the last boat from Genoa. So here I was. I had written about this, and we'd never talked about it. So in the schools, the importance of teaching history is very high. It's important. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study of high school seniors. Only 8% of 1,000 queried knew the cause of the Civil War was slavery.
Was what?
Only 8%. So education is dismal and needs to be improved. And remembering atrocities will help prevent future ones by acknowledging what happened.
We will come back. Julie.
I'm just sitting here and trying to figure out, he was talking about looking back to, the first 3 decades of the century in this country, in Europe, and then the next few decades. And it seems to me that, and help me with this really, that it was acceptable, and still is, for fewer people, but it's acceptable all this time in both continents for what we now call prejudices, and I mean, whether it was the Irish coming in, or whether it was the Germans coming in, or it was the Italians coming in this country. And in Europe, I mean, you're very ethnic conscious, the boundaries of, European boundaries that predated us. And it's not as if that all this time people have been just really believing in equality, but just didn't want to go another way, or, I mean, it's, you kind of get a sense what I'm struggling with here and not being very articulate about. I don't know that there was ever, a good time, Post-war, I mean, I grew up in Indiana in the 50s, and it was a segregated city until the Supreme Court ruling. My parents didn't go along with that at all, but it was okay, just like ethnic jokes, they're okay. So obviously our standards generally are much improved. But still, there has never been a time.
Well, they backtracked significantly.
Yeah, well,
recently.
yes, definitely, because it's all the basis of current politics. But that it's never really not been there, it's just being fed, being nurtured.
But one of, to me, the big challenge, I keep coming back to empathy of the other, because ultimately I think, how does the other become familiar to us that they're no longer the other? And I think the problem we have is there's so much, not conscious segregation, but there's so much tribalism where people go off to their groups. And I find, I use the example of having gone to this benefit event for refugees and met this, I think she was a Syrian woman, and she had her child there. And I spent an hour with her talking, and she was, I was getting from the Syrian refugees were abstract even to me. I mean, I said, who are these people, these millions of refugees? And I meet this person, and as I was talking to her, I was honestly thinking about my relatives. I said, it was just like them. They're going through what my relatives went through. And there was a connection to them that made me, it wasn't a forced empathy. It was an empathy that said, hey, they're part of, in the Jewish we have a word called mishpucha. They're part of the mishpucha of humanity. And that was the way I felt. And I think somehow we need to be more connected in that kind of way, because familiarity does not breed contempt. Familiarity breeds empathy. I think that's really critical. So that's the challenge. I mean, I think we're wired in a certain way because we tend to be more sympathetic, empathetic towards those who we're familiar with. And those who we're not familiar with, there's an instinctive fear. Exactly. So how do we overcome that? Part of it is intellectual, and telling stories, but there's some other about interacting, having interactions and people becoming familiar with the other.
I think the political climate, though, I just want to comment in response to that. I think the political climate we're in right now, though, keeps everybody sort of like juggling that your attention gets sidetracked from having empathy for other people because there's all this chaos in the political climate and distrust in the political climate. So I think a lot of your comments resonated very well in terms of the past and the present.
We have to, I thought we just have to try to do our best we can, that's all, and hope. Yeah.
I just want to mention my late husband had a story which was not too dissimilar from the one that you speak of in connection with your family. But my late husband was not a writer, and nor were his brothers. And what your speech has motivated me to make sure that I and those of my generation that were directly in contact with his family and the events of his family, make sure to write it down for our
or capture it orally.
Because they themselves did not write it down, but if you assemble all the bits that we have heard over the years, I think that ought to be written down for our important thing.
Yeah, Karen?
Just raised understanding and empathy. And I thought, well, wait a minute, in the South, before the Civil War, during slavery, they were very familiar. And even after, with blacks and African Americans, and even after they were closer, sometimes raised by the nannies, whatever, but it didn't change their thought. Something else was going on besides knowing this person, that it didn't work just by meeting them and being close.
And that's where demagogues come in, where they play upon, that's why I emphasize, demagogues play upon fear and anxiety. So people who might otherwise say, oh, so-and-so, the Muslim person down the street, I know that person. You know, I met them in the supermarket, and then you hear a demagogue saying, you know, they could be, you know, a terrorist or a rapist or what, and then, you know, it brings out the primeval emotions that we all have, that we have to figure out how do we contain them and how do we channel them in positive ways. Yeah. Yes.
I was going to say that sadly, tragically, as soon as people can define another group as sufficiently different, the next step in their cognition is to say they're subhuman. Therefore, we don't have to worry about how we treat them because they're not really people. They're subhuman. So, for example, the American Indian, the Native Americans, they were seen throughout, you know, the period, you know, with different tribes, they were seen as subhuman. Therefore, you know, we can massacre them.
With an economic incentive, you know, economic incentive.
It's also true, though, that these kind of prejudices have to be institutionalized. It's not just one person to the other. It's supported by institutions and systems.
Mike?
Robert, the questions have ranged broadly, shall we say. But I'd like to return to that note of optimism in the rabbi's remarks that you referred to. And so as we go out into the night to ponder all of the thoughts that you've given us, what's that note of hope and optimism that you would leave us with?
Well, I think there was that reflection, you said it, Rabbi Prinz, and in fact, I didn't quote it, but in that sermon, the title of the sermon is Jews Hopeful for a New Dawn, which was so confusing. When I read that, I was expecting to read something very differently in the article, and then boom, but he, at the end of his sermon, Rabbi Prinz says, we have to move on. We have no choice. We have to be upbeat, and we have to focus on the courage and the hope of those people who got us through that period. I mean, we did, despite, you know, the horrific tragedy, we got through the war, and we survived, and we became stronger. And so I wouldn't be up here doing this if I didn't have hope.